So, hello all, welcome. Thank you for being here, for sharing this space. Welcome to the very first 2022 episode of Co-opting AI, which today is on personality. My name is Dr. Mona Sloane. I am a sociologist at New York University, where I am, among other things, a fellow at the Institute for Public Knowledge, where I have been hosting the Co-opting AI series for almost 3 years now. At this point, I want to express my sincere thanks to the supporters of this series, which is, of course, the Institute for Public Knowledge, the 370J Project, and of course, the Tandon Department of Technology, Culture, and Society. Thank you for your ongoing support of the series. Now, before we begin this conversation today, I want to acknowledge that I'm standing on the unceded land of the Lenape peoples, and I ask you to join me in acknowledging the Lenape community and the indigenous communities on whose land you may be currently standing, and to commit to beginning the process of working to dismantle the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism. Now, about today's event. In a 2019 essay called Bodies as Borders, Achille Mbebe reflects on the modalities of planetary living as they interlace with corporate sovereignty, the computational speed regime, and the dialectics of entanglement and separation. For him, quote, a key feature of our time is the extent to which all societies are organized to the same principle, the computational. This principle of social organization has now reached what some deem the most human thing there is, personality. Now, AI-powered personality assessment solutions have grown into a market that is expected to grow to over $22 billion by 2031. This kind of seems somewhat unsurprising, spurred by the COVID-19 induced, quote, great resignation, with many people leaving their jobs. The recruiting profession is in need of tools that allow for a rapid turnover in all processes across the hiring funnel, including those in which personality may be deemed to play a role, for example, in candidate sourcing and assessment. Personality tests set out to determine personality traits in an individual, for example, introversion or extroversion. There is, of course, the infamous Myers-Briggs type indicator, which is a popular taxonomy, but also the Ocean model that is based on the big 5 personality traits: openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. In psychology, these personality traits are assumed to be stable. Now, personality tests actually do have a long history in management in American corporations, and automating them as part of, for example, candidate assessment could be seen as falling well into the general shift towards the automation of general managerial decision-making. And Kira Lucier is doing fabulous work on that. But personality tests also have a fraught and sometimes pseudo-scientific history that can find its continuation through AI-powered personality assessments. AI-powered personality assessment solutions that, for example, claim to automatically detect one's personality characteristics based on tone of voice have epistemological roots in psychological profiles of discrete personality types and physiognomic approaches that spuriously link biological components of vocalization to personality. Now, in our conversation today, we want to take a closer look at this development and examine this peculiar and potentially tricky marriage between the computational principle, to return to Achille Mbebe's words, and personality as a scientific concept. And truly, there could not be a more stellar panel to guide us through this exploration. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Ifeoma Ajunwa, Dr. Merve Emery, and Dr. Luke Stark. Dr. Ifeoma Ajunwa is an associate professor of law with tenure at UNC's School of Law. She's also the founding director of the AI decision-making research program. Professor Ajunwa has been faculty associate at the Berkman Klein Center at Harvard Law School since 2017, and her research focus is on race in the law, law and technology, employment and labor law, and health law. Her work has or will be featured in the California Law Review, Cardozo Law Review, Fordham Law Review, and Northwestern Law Review, among other top law journals for specialty areas. She has published op-eds in the New York Times, Washington Post, The Atlantic, and other venues, and her research has been featured in media outlets such as the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, CNN, Guardian, the BBC, and many more. In 2020, she testified before the US Congressional Committee on Education and Labor and has spoken before governmental agencies such as the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and so on. In 2018, the Association of American Law Schools awarded Professor Ajunwa the Derrick Bell Award in recognition of her scholarly and teaching efforts addressing racial discrimination. In 2019, the National Science Foundation selected her NSF CAREER Award proposal on automated hiring for funding. In 2020, she received a pioneering grant from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation to research genetic testing as part of Workplace Wellness Program, and she's currently a Fulbright Scholar. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. Merve Emery is an associate professor of English at the University of Oxford. She's the author and editor of many, many books, all of which are absolutely terrific. Among them are, for example, the Ferranti Letters, Once and Future Feminist, the annotated Mrs. Dalloway, and of course, The Personality Brokers from 2018, which was selected as one of the best books of 2018 by the New York Times, The Economist, NPR, CBC, and The Spectator, and informs the CNN and HBO Max documentary called Persona, which I highly recommend, which also features Dr. Ajunwa. She is finishing a book titled Post-Discipline, Literature, Professionalism, and the Crisis of the Humanities. And she's also writing a book called Love and Other Useless Pursuits. Her essay and criticism have appeared in publications ranging from the New York Review of Books, Harper's, the New York Times Magazine, The Atlantic, and the London Review of Books, as well as American Literature, American Literary History, and Modernism/Modernity. She has been the recipient of the Philip Leverhulme Prize, the Robert B. Silvers Prize for Literary Criticism, and the Nona Balakian Citation for Excellence in Reviewing by the National Book Critics Circle. Her work has been supported by the Whiting Foundation, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and the Leverhulme Trust, the Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Quebec, and the Institute for Advanced Study in Berlin. In 2022, she is serving as one of the judges of the International Booker Prize. Dr. Emery is also a contributing writer at The New Yorker. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us from abroad today. Also joining us today is Dr. Luke Stark, who is an assistant professor in the Faculty of Information and Media Studies at Western University in London, Ontario. His work is interrogating the historical, social, and ethical impacts of computing and AI technology. And it has appeared in journals, including the Information Society, as well as in popular venues such as Slate, the Globe and Mail, and the Boston Globe. Luke was previously a postdoctoral researcher in AI ethics at Microsoft Research and a postdoctoral fellow in sociology at Dartmouth College. He holds a PhD from the Department of Media, Culture, and Communication at NYU. And his book, Ordering Emotion, Histories of Computing and Human Feelings from Cybernetics to AI, is currently under contract with MIT Press. Thank you so much for joining us as well. And I will say it is absolutely wonderful to have such an international panel today with folks joining us from all over the planet. We will be hearing, as per usual, a short provocation from each of our panelists of about 5 to 7 minutes, and then we'll start a panel discussion between the four of us. Meanwhile, the audience, you, please put your questions or comments into the Q&A chat box, and I will be picking those up for our panelists as we delve into the Q&A part of this event. And with that, a sincere thanks, and I open the floor to Merve. Thank you so much.
Thank you for inviting me, Mona. I'm really delighted to be here. And thank you to my co-panelists. I will be speaking probably the least about AI and a little bit more about the history and the theory of personality as a concept. And so I'm really excited for you two to pick up on that history and to bring us into the present. I will also just add a caveat, which is that my babysitter came down with COVID. So my children have been, I wouldn't say locked in that other room, but they have been sequestered in that other room, but they might burst out at any minute. And if I have to go open a snack pack, please forgive me. And you guys can just have a conversation in my absence. I'll pick up wherever I leave off. So as Mona mentioned, in 2018, I published a book called The Personality Brokers that examined the rise of personality as a key discourse of service labor in the United States and also globally. The book began in the mid-19th century and went up to about the 1990s, but it was primarily concerned with the immediate post-war period when the reorganization or the beginning of the reorganization of developing economies around service labor made it necessary to find new ways to measure and to organize the kinds of managerial and communicative skills that were integral to interpersonal relations, or what sociologists like Arlie Hochschild have later called emotional labor, the emotional labor of service work. It is in that moment, I argue in my book, that the language of type, the language of personality type, emerges as a very, very powerful idiom with a great deal of institutional support, and institutional support that's coming from all of the major institutions of the post-war period, ranging from corporations to schools, to hospitals, to churches, and to the beginning or the not entirely developed psychoanalytic tradition in the United States. That idiom becomes extraordinarily important both for an ideology of individual self-realization, an example of what Michel Foucault calls a technology of the self, and for various ideologies of post-war social organization, particularly ideologies concerning efficiency of work and also concerning the kind of affective attachments that we want to make to the work that we do. I argue in my book that these two things, the individual idiom of self-realization and the ideology of social organization, have to be thought about dialectically. That individual claims to be a certain kind of personality rely on the language of personality type that are given to us by massive corporations, but that those claims also reproduce that personality type. They make that language available for other people to affirm, to contest, and to identify with. And so in this fairly complicated, fairly intimate dialectic between individuals and institutions, we have the birth of an entire regime of personality that is lodged at the heart of the evolving economy in the United States. And one provocation that I would just offer, although I think Mona was inviting this provocation in the way that she framed the conversation, is that there's nothing especially human, elementally or naturally human about the idea of personality. That it is a language or a framework that is being imposed onto people who then naturalize it as something elemental or essential, but that is not in any way ontologically the basis for personality. So that was the argument of the book. And like I said, it began in the mid-19th century and it went up to the 1990s. And at that point, the kinds of service work that were most accented by the language of type were still jobs that we think of as belonging to the professional managerial sector. So they were jobs on Wall Street, jobs in hospitals, jobs in schools. And as the testing of personality was largely limited to the office and to the institutions that prepared you for those kinds of professional managerial jobs. So as Mona also mentioned in her introduction, last year the book was adapted as a documentary feature film called Persona. And in Persona, the director, Tim Travers Hawkins, the producer, Julia Nottingham, and I, in my capacity as the executive producer, were interested in understanding how new kinds of technologies, particularly the kinds of technologies that both of my co-panelists work on, like automated hiring processes, had been wedded to this language of type, had expanded its remit, and had changed the classes of people or the groups that were being targeted, but that were being interpolated by its idiom of self-actualization. And to my mind, what the documentary showed really beautifully and with the help of some of my co-panelists was that in fact, what was previously a kind of professional managerial or white collar idiom of personality had, on the backs of these expanded technological systems of hiring, diffused, such that there were people who were interviewing for jobs as entry-level clerks, customer service representatives, store greeters, people working in warehouses, who were going through hiring processes where personality testing had become an integral part of automated decision-making and of screening certain kinds of candidates out. And that the language of type was often being used in all sorts of surreptitious and insidious ways as proxies for other things. So if you watch the documentary, one of the stories that it tells is of a young boy who believed he was taking a kind of personality assessment, but in fact, that assessment was a proxy for screening out people who were likely to have certain kinds of mental illnesses. And that this is used as a proxy because, of course, discriminating on the basis of any kind of mental illness or any kind of health concerns is wildly illegal. But this was a way of trying to get around the illegality of that kind of decision making. In some ways, that's a very old story. In fact, many of the first personality assessment systems during the post-war period were used to weed out applicants that were thought to be sympathetic to labor. In a moment when people were very suspicious of labor movements and their affiliation with communist or socialist ideology. So it's not at all surprising that we should see this happening again. What is surprising or what is troubling is the way that this complicates a particular story about personality that was told in the immediate post-war period. So when I wrote my book, one of the things that I observed was that the language of type is used to discriminate in the sense both implicitly and explicitly. And implicitly in the sense that only certain classes of people are given access to the kinds of tools that give them or bestow upon them the language of type. But also explicitly in that certain kinds of people, by virtue of their race, their gender, their intellectual or physical ability, were thought to simply not be able to have personalities in the first place. And so if these tools were exploitative, if they were wedding individual senses of self to these larger projects of corporate control, then there was some comfort maybe to be taken that they were doing it in a very limited way for a very limited group of people. But what we've seen over the past 30 or 40 years with the rise of these highly sophisticated technologies that expand the remit of personality testing is that that pool of people interpolated by it has gotten much, much, much larger. And I'm very eager to hear from my co-panelists about what we might do at a moment when those tools of exploitation are both much more expansive and also much more harder to, they're much harder to detect than what one would detect with a pen and paper questionnaire that was being hand scored by someone in a single office back room somewhere. So I will turn things over to the next speaker and say that I hope I've taken you from the, I hope I've transitioned us from the kind of historical, theoretical concerns about personality to you two, who will speak much more knowledgeably about how this all links up with AI.
Thank you so much, Mary. I really appreciate this terrific contribution, and also the kind of ending on scale, which Ifeoma, Dr. Ajunwa, Professor Ajunwa, that's a cue for you. You're next.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Professor Emre, for that wonderful introduction. I think your book has been so wonderfully influential in bringing to light the issues associated with personality testing, and I was so honored to be part of the documentary with you. My approach is going to be more legalistic. So, Professor Emre's approach was really looking at the history of this personality test, and I want to bring it back into what are the legal implications when employers choose to deploy this personality test, and what are the legal implications for when these tests can exist as intermediaries that are somewhat removed from the original conceptualization of the law. So, first I want to mention that, when Title VII, which is the major law in the United States that prohibits employment discrimination, was being conceptualized, of course, we had not had the advent of the internet, and we had not had the advent of automated decision-making, and therefore the law as it stands did not conceptualize or really take into account that those developments would be coming later. So the question then is, how can such laws then adequately address or adequately govern the introduction of these technologies that seek, and I'll use a word I use for my book, which is that seek to quantify workers. So for myself, I see the introduction of automated video interviews as an iteration of automated hiring platforms, which is yet another way to attempt to quantify workers as risks and liabilities. And as such, the automated hiring systems are operating as culling systems. So, in a prior empirical paper, a co-author and I, Dan Green, we discussed the development of automated hiring systems, and we investigated the raison d'etre, really, of their existence by looking at historical documents, documenting the impetus for their introduction, and also the way that were marketed to the first, buyers. And what we found was that automated hiring is really a misnomer, right? The idea is not really to, go out and hire people you would not otherwise have hired or find new people to hire. It's really to create an efficient calling system. So really they're automated rejection machines. And the idea, as explicitly we found in the trade brochures, was really to clone, and that's the word they use, clone your best worker, right? That using that word, clone your best worker, which is basically to replicate or recreate the workplace that you already have. Well, if you think about historical imbalances in workplaces that might have been due to racial discrimination or gender discrimination, then you can see that automated hiring programs may really be tools of service to discrimination and exclusion. When it comes to automated video interviewing, I see them really as the new phrenology. If you recall, phrenology was the pseudoscience that actually proliferated in the United States as advocated for by eugenics groups, with the belief that certain groups of people were naturally more trustworthy or better workers than other groups of people, and that this could be determined based on facial features or other physical characteristics. Well, I argue that automated video interviewing, with its sort of claims, pseudoscientific claims of being able to assess concrete emotions, concrete personality attributes from facial expressions, tone of voice, mannerisms, is really the new phrenology, is really replicating that pseudoscience. This has implications for Title VII. So under Title VII, employers are prohibited from discriminating against people on the basis of several protected categories, which include race. It also includes national origin. And then you have other laws that also prohibit discrimination on the basis of a disability. Yet you have automated interviewing, which are purporting to separate people based on physical attributes, some of which may actually be proxy variables, right, for these protected categories. So for example, in the United States, accent discrimination is mostly legal as long as the employer can proffer a business reason or business interest in excluding people with certain accents. Well, with automated video interviewing, it does become clear that people with accents may be disadvantaged when you have limited training data, where the automated video interview program has been trained on a set that may be mostly people from a certain nationality group, or mostly, frankly, male, because men and women do speak differently, for example. You also have interactions with disabilities. When it comes to automated video interviewing, some of the variables, such as eye contact, such as tone of voice, such as body movements, may also present themselves in a way that's disfavorable to people who are neurodivergent, or people who suffer from mental illness or have other disabilities. So the question then is the law as it stands adequate to ensure that employers who deploy automated video interviewing as really a culling system may not really be using those systems as a way to exclude applicants who actually fall into these protected categories? So I'll stop there, because I definitely want us to have ample time to hear Luke, Professor Stark, and also get to the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ajunwa, for that also wonderful contribution, which we just talked about in our green room, comes at a perfect moment in time, as in the United States, just a few hours ago, an updated Algorithmic Accountability Act was proposed. So we're seeing a lot of movement in that space, which is very interesting. And that is a good cue for Luke, Dr. Stark, to share your provocation with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mona, and it's a pleasure to be here with such a truly distinguished panel. Merve, being on the Booker Prize panel, that's amazing. just to fanboy for a moment. Yeah, to have the three of you, this is really a pleasure and a delight. So my provocation, and I'll just share my screen, is a little bit historical, a little bit conceptual, and maybe a little bit legal at the end. I may talk less about AI than one might think. But we'll see how it goes. One of the things that I've been really interested in as I've been working on my book on emotion and the history of computing is precisely the same issues that Dr. Ajunwa has mentioned, right? The question, the kind of connection between physiognomy and phrenology, these kind of 19th and early 20th century pseudosciences, grounded in scientific racism and really grounded in the kind of apparatus of 19th century scientific discrimination and colonial power, how that how that echoes through sometimes very explicitly and directly into kind of contemporary artificial intelligence techniques. We talk a little bit about that, we being myself and my co-author, Jevin Hudson, a great legal scholar, in a piece that is also coming out this coming year, a legal piece on physiognomic AI. And I think Ifeoma, we should compare notes here, because I think we're doing a lot of the same things. I think we probably even cite you. But in the background to thinking about this question of physiognomy and phrenology, I've found it really helpful to draw on the work of an Italian historian named Carlo Ginzburg, who's well known to historians, and his distinction between what he calls conjectural science and empirical science or deductive science. And as a very long story short, right, Ginsburg identifies this history of conjectural disciplines that look that are kind of post hoc, right? They look into the past for clues, and they are they're very much focused on the individual incident. The best example of somebody doing this kind of induction, right, is Sherlock Holmes, right? This was one of the examples he gives. Somebody who says he's deducing all the time, but actually he's inducing from particular clues, to make judgments about individuals. And this actually describes very nicely the way that physiognomy as a discourse in the 19th century circulated, right? That physiognomy, was all about it was in some ways about determining at a quick glance your status in the urbanizing metropoli of the 19th century. So Holmes does that. If you've ever read a Sherlock Holmes story, of course he does it infallibly because he's a fictional character, right? The truth, of course, is much more complicated and much less infallible, right? In fact, as the historian Sharona Pearl has written about, and many other people have written about, right, the history of physiognomy and then phrenology, this kind of scientific offshoot of it, or quote unquote pseudoscientific offshoot of it, is really all about creating these kind of associations, right? Sometimes they're kind of very, very loose and sort of almost literary or artistic. And the desire has been by those in power, right, those with in charge of the colonial state, to make those relationships, to find kind of quote unquote scientific legitimacy in them. So someone like Sir Francis Galton, tries to do this with photographs of criminals to try to determine if there are particular facial features that that are indicative of criminality. Doesn't work. But even into the early 20th century, we have, and I think Merve, your book talks about this, right? You have a kind of cottage industry of phrenological and physiognomic manuals for white collar professionals, for people who are it's almost like self-help. You're trying to figure out how to relate and engage with other people. And this is, of course, all completely racist, right? It's grounded in the idea of kind of hierarchies and taxonomies that are kind of hugely problematic. So what does this have to do with AI, right? Other than the fact that Commander Data there from Star Trek: The Next Generation is often portrayed as Sherlock Holmes. It has to do with AI because, fundamental to many of the conversations about kind of automated decision making based on large data sets is this idea, right, that the kind of correlations you can find out of large data sets make theoretical underpinnings obsolete. And in some ways mean that we can take those theoretical underpinnings as we can take that data as a kind of ground truth, right? That we can rely on the data to produce a kind of mirror to the natural world. And there have been many critiques of this, which I entirely agree with. But I think my provocation here is to say that a large amount of the AI, the AI analysis, the automated decision-making analysis that we see today is actually what Ginsburg would call conjectural, right? It's conjectural science. It's looking to the past, right? It's picking up clues. It's trying to find, and trying to then extrapolate things from those clues. And critically, right, even though, we speak in the language of statistics and confidence intervals, it's still fundamentally it really can't be replicated, right? You can't, you can't assume, that some 95% positive prediction is actually going to be true for any one individual person in that set of 100 people you are running the prediction on. In other words, right, that there's a kind of conceptual problem with the idea that much of the kind of AI analysis we do on people has the kind of scientific legitimacy that it's often given, both by its creators and also by people in the press and certainly people in government. And so, what this leaves me with, and of course, there's this desire, right? This is a problem that has not escaped the powers that be. This is the famous slide from the NSA leak by Edward Snowden, right, pointing out that the NSA really wants to know more about all of these conjectural disciplines like anthropology and history and magic. But I think we should take Ginsburg at his word that any knowledge based on making these individualizing distinctions is always liable to specific biases. And I think we need to think a lot more about how to regulate the application of different inferential techniques, right? And different kind of instances of conjecture, right? In things like hiring, in areas where automated decision making is being used. So, right, putting aside all the other highly relevant critiques of AI around bias, around incorrect data, I think we also need to attend to how this concept of conjecture and its grounding in this history of physiognomy and physiology can help us understand AI today. Great, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Luke, Dr. Stark, for this presentation as well, which is a wonderful kind of closing of our provocation round. At which point I want to invite our audience to start putting questions into the Q&A. If you have questions or comments for our terrific panel, please do so. I will be curating those. And I am mindful of time, so I'm just going to ask one kind of question before I really want to invite the panelists to perhaps engage with each other's provocations and statements and observations. And I'm going to do something that I typically don't do at this point in the event, which is starting from the end, which is the question, where do we go from here? And the reason why I'm asking that is precisely because we are seeing mounting regulation, we're seeing more research, more critique. We are also perhaps seeing a profession of recruiters who want to do the right thing, who are actually perhaps interested in finding out how these technologies can be used in a way that does not amplify discrimination. And so these are tension points that we're seeing everywhere. And I actually agree with the panelists that we need these interdisciplinary perspectives and expertise based on lived experience to start even thinking about how things connect. So I want to invite maybe every panelist to very briefly respond to, where do we go from here? Merve.
Wow. So my initial impulse is to move slightly away from where we go in terms of technology, in terms of AI, because I think my co-panelists will have better answers to that, and to think a little bit about where we go in terms of ideology critique. So for me, one of the most pernicious ideologies is the way that psychic life, psychological life has not only been made available for exploitation by capital, but how an entire affirmative language encouraging that exploitation has been laminated onto it, i.e. the idea that you must love what you do, or that if you are doing the thing that is best for your personality type, you will bind yourself to it freely and gladly. and that you will continue to perform your personality alongside other forms of emotional labor. And that these performances will become, as Hochschild says, so deeply embedded that it will be difficult to differentiate between what is a shallow kind of performance and what is actually part of yourself. So for me, as someone who focuses so much on language, the most important thing to start doing is to begin to peel off those highly pernicious layers of language that contribute to these ideologies, and to start thinking about what it might look like or how we might talk about work if we didn't believe that it was supposed to be a place where we became fully self-realized individuals. How might things differ if instead of talking about the extroversion or introversion or the emotional intelligence of our personalities, we started talking about the relations between labor and capital that make it possible for people to demand that we make our emotions available or our personalities available to others for this kind of interrogation and organization. So I would start, perhaps unsatisfyingly, with language.
Thank you so much for that. I appreciate that. And that is, I think, a really important point, because as we think about policy and we think about bringing in lived experience as well, I think language becomes a really crucial kind of lever to actually do that. And I'm very curious, Dr. Ajunwa, to hear your response to that initial prompt that I presented.
Yes, so yeah, and thinking through where we go from here, I definitely I'm thinking with my legal hat on, which is what can the law actually do, and how do we recognize some of the limitations of current law, and how can we sort of ameliorate those limitations to actually then properly address the realities of the digital age, the realities of the automated decision-making that is happening now. So for me, when I look at automated video interviewing, there is a little bit of I think there is a little bit of a techno-realism to how I would approach it. And I want to just sort of delve into that a bit. So in my prior writings, I've certainly written against techno-solutionism, right? Which is this idea that most of our societal problems can be solved with technology. Eugene Morrow, that's his concept. But I actually think we also need to be techno-realist, which is that in the sort of climate we now live in, the sort of work climate, and also, I don't want to say post-COVID, but I will say it in a hopeful kind of way, in the sort of post-COVID era we're living in, automated video interviewing will continue to present itself, right, as a convenience, as a necessity. So I think saying we should outrightly ban it is not going to be really realistic. But I do think we also can think of other legal means of imposing some governance on it that will actually perhaps curb its discriminatory potential. So for example, HireVue is, sort of the leader, right, in automated video interviewing. And as of 2021, it claimed to have stopped the use of facial analysis. Now, I will use the word claim because I don't know for sure. And I don't know that anybody can know for sure because of something that I think is still lacking and which I think the law can fix, which is actually the mandated audits of these technologies. HireVue claimed to have done an audit, but once again, this was a private audit by a third-party agency. And I think actually that governmental agencies should be involved in auditing these technologies because they are gateways to employment for vast majority of people in the United States, and are even more likely to impact people who are already economically vulnerable. So I think, if there can be any sort of redress or any sort of any sort of guard against economic exclusion and unlawful discrimination. The law does need to change and take a realist approach where perhaps these technologies cannot be banned outright, but there can be meaningful audits, meaningful and transparent audits. They can also be sort of changes in legal doctrine. I was just typing in the Q&A box about my idea for a new cause of action actually to be added to Title VII. This would be discrimination per se, which is different from the two existing causes of action, which are disparate treatment or disparate impact causes of action. Because as it stands, both of those causes of action present really an untenable burden for the claimant. It's really a high bar of proof required for any claimant in the United States to actually even bring a prima facie case. I think discrimination per se, which can allow a plaintiff just to point to one egregious conduct that they have encountered with any automated hiring program, whether automated video interviewing or not, and then have that egregious conduct be a trigger that actually shifts the burden of proof onto the employer to show that their program is not discriminatory. I think that would be a big help towards actually ensuring that these programs are comporting with the legal doctrine of equal opportunity for all applicants.
Thank you for that. And I much appreciate the realism here and the idea of incremental steps and the idea of audits, which I kind of do see related to what Merve has said about language as a way to allowing us maybe imagine what kind of other ways of control are actually possible. Dr. Stark, over to you, and then we'll turn to our fantastic questions from the audience.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, I think one thing that I find as a historian working sometimes in tech with digital technologies is how valuable it is to kind of have a sense of what is novel and what isn't novel as a way of kind of pricking the balloon of hype and of inevitability that often follows, the development of these systems, right? And so I think one of the valuable things about considering, the genealogy of contemporary digitally mediated personality testing, going back through to things like Myers-Briggs that Merve has written about, back to physiognomy and phrenology, right, is to point to, it's the failures of this idea, the repeated failure of this idea that you can produce a kind of scalable assessment of an individual's personality, but also to really contextualize for policymakers, right, that this is something they've dealt with before. So in the paper that I co-wrote with Jevin, and Jevin is the legal whiz, and actually is Jevin Hudson, my co-author, is the behind or has helped on a number of the Washington state privacy bills that propose various kind of bans and regulation of various kinds of AI automated decision making in public accommodation. There are laws on the books in the United States that ban phrenology, that ban these kind of techniques already, right? And so just because a Silicon Valley company says that they're doing something really fancy and cool and objective doesn't make it true. So I think that's, I'm gonna kind of vehemently, well, not vehemently, I'm gonna respectfully disagree with Ifeoma and say that I think we can think about banning some of these technologies. I think the discussion on facial recognition over the last 2 or 3 years has been really instructive, where 2 or 3 years ago, it seemed very, very hard to imagine concrete moratoria and bans on these systems. And since then, we've seen that to the point where I think many companies don't want to talk about the fact that they're doing facial recognition anymore, even though they still are. So, I think we should really aim high, both in articulating the connection of these systems to kind of historical injustices, and to doing something about it through the mechanisms we already have. We have a lot of legal avenues around anti-discrimination, unfair and deceptive practices, And so I think it's fantastic that there are folks like Dr. Ajunwa and many others who are thinking about how to take those broad abstract insights and put them into the law.
So I do want to add one nuance, to what I said, in response to Professor Stark, which is, while I don't necessarily think it would be why I don't necessarily think you would be efficacious to outrightly ban all the technology, I do still believe we can ban some design features, right? So for example, we could have automated video interview without the facial analysis.
Oh, sure.
Truly have that. And we could enforce that, right? If there were actually meaningful audits to see, what to check when, companies are using this technology. So yeah, so I just wanted to add that nuance.
We are in vehement agreement, as sometimes I like to say.
I would love to, and maybe that will happen, have another co-opting event on audits, because that is also a favorite of mine. But I want to kind of turn back to personality and ask Dr. Emery Merveille about Carl Jung. And we have a question in the audience from Herb Klitzner, who asks, what do you think Carl Jung's potential contributions to the issues raised today could be?
Well, I mean, historically, it was Jung's system, or it was his book, that was so inspirational for Catherine Briggs and later Isabel Briggs Myers. And one of the more human things that I talk about in the book is how Catherine Briggs actually, I think, sort of fell in love with Carl Jung and became one of his correspondents, and actually ended up writing erotic fan fiction about him and about his personality typing system. So in that sense, he already made a kind of libidinal contribution that goes some way toward explaining why we are where we are today. But it was very much his language of type and also of archetype that I think was so immensely attractive to those two women. And the fact that that language was incredibly plastic. So what introvert and extrovert meant in 1920, what they meant to Carl Jung, has almost nothing to do with the way that those terms have been mobilized by modern corporations in order to do precisely what Ifeoma said, which is reproduce a particular kind of worker, to clone the pre-existing workforce along those lines. And that language is used to justify that kind of intense self-reproduction. So I think he's more useful as a kind of historical figure for understanding how we got where we are today, but also his terms are useful as kind of symptomatic markers of what it is that corporations, institutions, the government, schools want out of their ideal workers, out of their ideal personality types. Can I say something really quickly to Luke? Which is that I am fascinated, Luke, by how you turn to the figure of the detective, because, Isabel Briggs Myers wrote detective fiction, and the capacity to detect personality, the capacity to detect was both an integral component of personality, but also what the person kind of sniffing out personality thought of themselves as doing.
Right.
Except her books were not preoccupied with phrenology, they were preoccupied with race science and with blood science.
Yeah.
Which is unseeable, right? It's invisible.
Right. But I think the anxiety is the same, and the kind of desire to kind of jump in on the carceral state, I think, is the same. That's fascinating. I didn't realize that she was a race scientist, but that's not surprising at all.
Well, a fictional one, but
sure.
Still,
yeah. Or interested in it. Yeah.
So we're kind of coming up at time, so I'm going to take the liberty of keeping you maybe just a few minutes longer, if that is okay. And we do have a couple of more questions in the Q&A section. We have one question that reached me not through the Q&A, which I think could be a good closing round. So I'm going to prioritize that one, which is a question about time. And the question how these constructs, the idea, these ideologies, these operationalizations, old laws, new laws, that are attached to personality and that are attached to the idea that personality testing can be scaled by way of artificial intelligence change over time? How do these different time scales connect to one another? And maybe we'll go in the same order. Merve, with you first, if that's okay.
Yeah, that's fine. And then I actually have to jump off because I have to unlock the door to my kids' room and take them somewhere for a 6:15 start. So the question was, how do these ideologies change over time? It's a difficult question to ask. I mean, it's a difficult question to answer in part because I wonder if the ideologies themselves are certain ideas about, I mean, let me put it this way. So to me, the idea that really grounds people's interest in personality is a kind of belief or a commitment to the individual, and the individual as the most important unit of social and psychological and sociological analysis, right? That what we care about is how it is that individual people feel, how they think, how they organize their psychic lives, how they project that outward. And I actually wonder what would happen if we just got rid of the idea of personality altogether. I mean, maybe this is on par with Luke's suggestion, like, why do we need these? We can certainly ban these kinds of things. I don't really know that we need this discourse of personality anymore. And I would say that maybe the most important thing to do is to really start developing a vocabulary, a better vocabulary for collectivity, and for thinking about how it is that we not how we assess kind of individual psychic reality, but rather how we assess the social conditions that we all occupy. So I would just say we need to get rid of the language of personality altogether, because it's not clear to me that it has generated anything good. I'm being called.
That is a good cue.
Yes, go to the bathroom. All right, I'm out. I have to do bathroom duty. Say hi, guys.
Thank you.
When are you gonna go back?
No, I'm not gonna go back. I'm gonna okay, bye guys. Bye.
Thank you. So getting rid of personality altogether, that's a good cue. Dr. Ajunwa, what do you think?
I think I'm going to go even deeper than that, which is really to ask, what is the sort of sorting or, sieving of personality types? What is it really in service of? And I'm going to say it's really in service of, at least in America, this very American notion of meritocracy. It's in service of the fact that there are some people who deserve jobs, who deserve certain jobs, and others who do not. This meritocracy is also very much also bound up, and I wrote an essay about this. I can, send a link to this, really bound up in this idea, the type of capitalism we have in the United States, which, sees itself as benevolent, as sort of inspiring, as, pushing people to their best potential. So I think beyond letting go of personalities, maybe we do need to let go of the idea of meritocracy as the overarching sort of organizing principle for society. And we need to start thinking more of solidarity as a way of life, where we're more accepting that, yes, people will be different, whether you want to call it personality or maybe just life circumstance, right? And that, personality types are really just a reflection of a lot of times accidents of birth and accidents of socioeconomic status, and that maybe we want to replace those sort of preoccupations with acceptance and, going beyond tolerance, right? With just really acceptance and solidarity and compassion, and that everybody can really thrive in the workplace, and that you don't need certain types versus other types solely. So that's my tech talk.
Wonderful, thank you. So let's get rid of personality and meritocracy while we're at it and really center solidarity in community. Thank you for that. Look, Dr. Stark, what do you want to add to the list?
I agree with that. And I think, I mean, to your question about time and time scales, I think one thing, this is also, again, at a high level, you know, the idea of the second chance, right? The idea that you're not bound by, you're not entirely bound by by what you've done in the past. That is an idea, right? Is an idea about human autonomy. It's the idea that you can change, right? And that hopefully you can change for the better. Sure, you can change for the worse, but I mean, right? I mean, we have lots of literature, lots of kind of narratives about that possibility for change and redemption, if you want to use that word, right? And I think you know, as I think both Merve and Ifeoma have kind of said, right? The issue with these systems, the automation of personality and other kinds of behavioral tracking and targeting and sorting, isn't just that they supposedly say something with the world, right? It's that they reify and replicate the thing that they're creating over and over again, right? So here's a really topical example. So a colleague of mine did work with the national weather forecasting folks, and as part of their training, this not where, you know, just a random example, as part of their training, they had to take the Myers-Briggs. And they told my friend, this researcher, that some of them told her that they couldn't talk to her because of their Myers-Briggs personality type, which meant that they were introverted, so they wouldn't be able to, you know, talk about themselves, right? So there's this enormous. I think Merve is right that the personality really focuses on the individual, but there's also an enormous anxiety above individuals to find this kind of evidence for their own. Right, to find evidence for their own immutability, right? So there's a tremendous discomfort and tension around mutability and versus immutability in the individual, and some people really often, at least for initially, they run to and embrace these personality types, you know, whatever they are, Myers-Briggs or some personality type thing you've done on the internet, as a symbol of something. But I think. You know, I think that in the much longer view, I think this is where psychoanalysis in some ways is very opposed to personality typing, right? Psychoanalysis, you know, for all its faults, you know, does have a kind of understanding of reflection and kind of dialectical deepening and richening that kind of pushes us outside this idea of a kind of shallow personality.
Thank you for that, Luke. And I think that is a wonderful note to end on, the question, what does it mean both for the collective and for ourselves to ask questions around personality testing, and artificial intelligence. We are 8 minutes over time, and I am going to take the liberty of gently closing our event today. My apologies to those who have asked questions, some of which have kindly been answered by Dr. Ajunwa already. Thank you for that. You can find all of our panelists on the internet. And if you have pressing questions, I'm sure you can send them an email and they may respond to you. So I encourage you to do that. And I want to express my gratitude to our panelists for coming here today from all different parts of the world, bringing their expertise and their generosity. Thank you for that. Also, thank you to the team at IPK, and thank you, the audience, for joining us in this space today. Please join us again for our next Co-opting AI events, which will look at the climate emergency, at age, and at beauty. And with that, thank you so much. Take good care of yourself and have a wonderful evening, night, rest of the day. Take care. Bye-bye.